Welcome to News 24, Thursday, November 21st, 2013. I'm your host, Grace Johnson, and tonight on News 24, we will be taking an in-depth look at Megan's Law. We will provide you with valuable information about the events leading up to the implementation of the law. We will also evaluate the policy by presenting you with different perspectives, allowing you to look at the policy from different angles in order for you to better understand these facts and figures. This is Megan's Law, a policy analysis. In order for us to fully understand the policy, we must first look at the issue and problem that created the need for a policy such as Megan's Law. Sex offender registration was no new concept. In the mid-1900s, various laws requiring registry could be seen from state to state. Megan Conka's story inspired what we now know as Megan's Law. The policy was passed into law in 1994 in New Jersey, but now the law has gone nationwide. Different states have different procedures for disclosing information, but one thing is consistent: the public must be notified. Someone can be classified as a sex offender by legal jurisdiction and by the cultural patterns of a society. In America, a person can be convicted as a sex offender because of prostitution, child molestation, rape, sexual exposure in public, as well as various other types of sexual assault. Looking at the most recent statistics on sexual offenses in the United States, it is clear that sexual assault is a prevalent issue. According to the Criminal Justice Agency, there are currently 747,408 registered sex offenders in the U.S., and about 20% of those convicted of a sex crime will be reconvicted later in life. Now, let's go to Lee Kanji, who is speaking with a politician who can provide us with further information on this topic.
Thank you, Grace. Joining us tonight, we have former Senator Oscar Salgado. Senator, thank you so very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you, Ms. Kanji. It's a pleasure to be here.
When was Megan's Law first introduced?
The New Jersey legislation was actually passed in 1994, but the federal law wasn't passed until 1996.
Were you in office at the time that it was passed into law, Senator?
Ma'am, I was actually beginning my second term as senator at the time.
And Senator, would you say that Megan's Law was cohesive with the contemporary style of that time?
Megan's Law are actually state and federal laws that require convicted sex offenders to register with local police and to notify enforcement authorities whenever they move to a new location. The brutality of the crimes in the Megan Kanka case actually provided that much-needed push for law and mandated registration of sex offenders to correspond with community notifications. Now, in 1994, Congress passed the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. This was actually the precursor of the federal Megan's Law, conditioned that obviously certain federal law enforcement funds state adoption of sex offender registration laws and set minimum standards for states to follow. By 1996, though, every state, to include the District of Columbia, the federal government, and other agencies as such, had enacted what we now know as the Megan's Law. Now, in New York, the Sex Offender Registration Act, or SORA, which is technically our version of the Megan's Law, or our adaptation of it, requires everyone on parole or probation, or actually that was in prison for any sex offense from January 21st of '96 or after, to register within the Division of Criminal Justice Services. In addition, sex offenders that were sentenced to probation, local jail, or state prison after that date must register upon their return to the community. Now, the law is amended periodically in New York State Legislature to add, registerable offenses. There's a list that's updated continuously that you can definitely find on the internet.
Could you tell us if there were similar policies in the past, or if there has been any similar policies since Megan's Law was passed?
Well, actually, on May 17, 1996, the federal efforts to strengthen the Jacob Weltering Act got a boost when then-President Bill Clinton signed the amendment to the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. The amendment is actually, in fact, what we now know as Megan's Law. Here in New York, we can also translate that as the Sex Offenders Registration Act, or like I mentioned before, the SORA. This legislation directs all state legislatures to adopt laws requiring convicted sex offenders to register with their local law enforcement agencies after they are released. Additionally, the federal Megan's Law mandates states to grant access to sex offender registrations to the public. Although sex offender registration for law enforcement purposes has not been entirely new idea, what is new is the idea of letting the community actually have access to this sort of information.
Was there a noticeable public reaction after the passing of Megan's Law?
Well, whenever there is a public issue that causes an intense emotion, people want legislation. They want to see change. It's completely understandable that people or the public would be distraught, especially let's say after hearing what happened to Megan Kanka and all these other children. They want action. This action would help them heal and help give them a measure of meaning to Megan's life. So when the law was passed, the famous healing began. And the public was definitely pleased when the decision was actually affirmed to pass the law.
And Senator, would you say that there was representative of the values of the majority of the public?
People want to protect the children. So personally, yes, I do think that it definitely represents the public values.
Does this policy satisfy any specific relevant interest group?
Megan's Law was actually a response to community outrage. It was developed to alert the public of the presence of sex offenders living within the community. The premise was and still is that with this knowledge, citizens can take protective measures against these nearby sex offenders. Community members, specifically parents, get the most satisfaction out of this policy. Public notification law gives us the impression of making people feel safer and of it being a more workable solution to the child abuse problem.
And Senator, in your opinion, is Megan's Law politically acceptable?
Well, media stereotypes about people sexually abusing children can make it seem all very overwhelming. But I guess the initial point would be to start learning the facts. Accurate information about these situations can help you turn that fear into confidence. That confidence that can later be that point where you can realize you can, in fact, keep your family safe. This law was not made with the intent to stigmatize offenders who have, let's say, paid their dues and did some time, but rather more to actually help the community become educated and to keep a watchful eye. It is possible, yes, that a person will repent from his or her crimes, but statistically, you can actually know that there is a risk that that person will commit that crime again. And now, is that a risk that you are willing to take with your children? That's an important question. At the same time, this law does keep in mind to try to prevent such acts from happening again, and to, again, just keep your children safe. So for the sake of our kids, for the sake of my kids and yours, I absolutely do think that it's politically acceptable and completely worth it.
Well, Senator Salgado, we really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us tonight. Thank you so very much. Back to you, Grace.
Well, thank you, Ms. Major, for having me. It was my pleasure.
Let us now take a look back at the moment that Senator Salgado described when President Bill Clinton signed Megan's Law back in 1996.
I want to welcome Senator Grams, Congressman Zimmer, Congresswoman Lofgren, Lonnie Campbell from the Justice Department. This has been a week in which our country is moving to combat crime and violence. A couple of days ago, we awarded over 9,000 new police officers to some 2,500 communities. That brings us to 43,000 police officers in 20 months along the road to our goal of 100,000. We're ahead of schedule and under budget. But today, the valiant presence of 5 American parents reminds us that this fight against crime is so much more a fight for peace and for safety for our people, and especially for our children. Richard and Maureen Kanka, Patty Wetterling, Mark Klass, and John Walsh have suffered more than any parent should ever have to suffer. They have lived through the greatest pain a parent can know, a child brutally ripped from a parent's love. And somehow they found within themselves the strength to bear a further burden. They took up the parents' concerns for all children's safety and dedicated themselves to answering that concern. Each of you deserves the fullest measure of your country's thanks. Because of you, steps have already been taken to help families protect their children. Study after study has shown us that sex offenders commit crime after crime. So 2 years ago, we gave every state the power to notify communities about child sex offenders and violent sex offenders who move into their neighborhoods. We're fighting now to uphold these laws in courts all across the country, and we will fight to uphold them all the way to the Supreme Court. Today we are taking the next step. From now on, every state in the country will be required by law to tell a community when a dangerous sexual predator enters its midst. We respect people's rights, but today America proclaims there is no greater right than a parent's right to raise a child in safety and love. Today, America warns, if you dare to prey on our children, the law will follow you wherever you go, state to state, town to town. Today, America circles the wagon around our children. Megan's Law will protect tens of millions of families from the dread of what they do not know. It will give more peace of mind to our parents. To understand what this law really means, never forget its name. The name of a 7-year-old girl taken wrongly in the beginning of her life. The law that bears the name of one child is now for every child, for every parent and every family. It is for Polly and Jacob and Adam, and above all, for Megan. I thank the Congress for passing it. I thank those who led the fight, and I thank these families more than anything else. God bless you all.
In that emotional clip, President Clinton made reference to an increase in the police force nationwide when he said, "We are ahead of schedule and under budget." Now, let's go back to Lee Kanji, who is now speaking with economist Guillermo Sandoval to find out more information on the financial aspects of this law.
And now we have economist and author of the book, Safety at All Costs, Guillermo Sandoval. You are an expert on policy analysis. How would you describe the economic feasibility of Megan's Law?
Economic feasibility. Well, in order to explain economic feasibility, we must first understand a major controversy that actually complicates and influences people's perception of economic feasibility. Unlike most policies, this particular policy has kept its overall popularity despite the fact that various studies have failed to prove decrease in recidivism. It has obviously become very evident through these studies that pinpointing the actual catalyst responsible for these recent decreases in sexual assaults has been challenging, giving some ammunition to groups attempting to abolish it. Despite this lack of proof and the fact that the cuts funding has steadily risen, most opposition has not gained much ground, and changing the law does not seem probable. The reason for this can be attributed to simple human psychology and behavior. It is human instinct to self-preserve, and most importantly, safeguard their family members. Therefore, most people do not have qualms on funding, when the goal is a safer environment. Megan's law increases the amount of protection that parents can offer the most precious and innocent members of our society, our children. But, nevertheless, back to the economics of it. The costs have steadily risen since its inception, but it seems security is a priceless commodity to our society. One economic fact that is extremely interesting and not widely known, it's something that, for lack of knowledge, people overlook, and that is the externalities that are generated by the registry itself. For instance, individuals don't have the skills to return to a job. At times, they're denied a job. Much of the hatred towards them creates psychological problems. So where do they turn? To social welfare programs. Those externalities actually do become costs that we're not even considering when we think of the law itself.
So, Mr. Sandoval, for those that are opposed to the sex offender registry, are there any other alternatives?
You know, as far as alternatives, they do provide some, but they have a major flaw. The policy, basically none of them, in fact, would provide the same security effect. The effect where mothers and fathers can now check to see where these individuals live and provide that security for their kids. People are basically accustomed to it, and it would be very difficult to take that away now. For instance, a lot of people talk about more rehabilitation programs and longer jail sentences, counseling, and education. All of these measures cost a lot of money and do not give people peace of mind. Why should we worry about and concentrate on the perpetrator and put aside the danger of not knowing where these individuals may be residing? Another thing that is positive about the registry is today's communication venues. They reach all over the world, and they actually make the process cheaper. So internet registries, as opposed to having officers knock on doors like they did in the past. Another idea is having them essentially segregated and live in shelters, but that has proven to be both dangerous and costly. So, in the end, I don't think right now they've provided an alternative that's going to satisfy and appease the public. And I think people will always think of children first. So, not too many good alternatives for the opposers, unfortunately.
That's very interesting, Mr. Sandoval. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that of your own?
Basically, the only thing I can add to the externalities is that they're disadvantaged people, and they become marginalized on their own doing. They now have a stigma, and most people can't deal with the fact that these people molest children. So it is undoubtedly that they will end up having to depend on social services. And like I said before, that will in the end cost more, and it will in no shape or form give people peace of mind.
Thank you so much for all of that insightful information tonight, Mr. Sandoval. And ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to go out and buy Mr. Sandoval's book, Safety at All Costs.
Well, thank you for having me. And, I just want to add that when it comes to policy, most of the time we do want to be as fair as we can to all parties. But there is times in life when the scale has to be tipped. I find that it generally has to be tipped when it's involving women and children. In my book, Safety at All Costs, you can get some more information about different policies that talk about safety, fairness, and basically an assessment of how the laws should be viewed when it involves different parties.
So far this evening, we've spoken to an expert economist and a politician about their opinions regarding the policy that is Megan's Law. Now, we go back to Lee Kanji, who is gaining a more humanist perspective by speaking with social worker Skylar Braun.
Good evening, Ms. Braun.
Good evening, Ms. Kanji.
It is my understanding that as a social worker, there are many values that you are expected to uphold. Is that correct?
Yes, there are. The 6 core values are service, social justice, the dignity and worth of all people, the importance of human relationships, and integrity. These values are integral to the profession. They serve as a guide to our everyday work in assisting our clients.
Ms. Braun, can you please elaborate on the compatibility of these social work values and Megan's Law?
Social workers are known for standing up for the victims and the underserved. Although most people would expect that Megan's Law would be compatible with all of the values, it is important to remember that social workers are expected to meet their clients under their current circumstances. Sometimes it's easier to empathize with some.
So would you say that the social work values are compatible when you are referring to the victims, Ms. Braun?
Yes, absolutely. Although it is debatable whether the values are compatible to Megan's Law when your client is a sex offender, there is little debate as to whether the values are compatible with Megan's Law when your client is the victim of sexual abuse. Dignity and worth of the person is an important principle, especially when working with victims. These victims have been through a lot, and it is vital that they feel safe in their environment and continue to get help and service to promote their self-worth.
Ms. Braun, does Megan's Law contribute to equity and justice?
They have tried creating trailer parks for sex offenders or creating whole communities of sex offenders, but none of these options have worked. It has been very risky because sex offenders living together can increase the likelihood of recidivism. Many sex offenders in this country are living in motels because that is their only option. Megan's Law has also contributed to violent acts against sex offenders. When their information is made available to the public, they are put at risk of getting hurt or killed. Most people don't recognize these social issues that have come up in response to the legislation.
And has Megan's Law caused further social issues, or do you expect it to in the future?
Think about this for a second. Imagine you live in a safe, family-oriented neighborhood, and you and your neighbors send your children to the playground to play with each other. There is a sense of trust amongst neighbors and a strong sense of community. Now imagine discovering that a convicted sex offender is living in your neighborhood. What would you feel? Anyone could agree that it might bring up a range of feelings: fear, anger, lack of safety, loss of control. One of the biggest causes of fear is, in fact, not knowing. Sometimes just having more information can diminish those feelings. There really are many things you can do to make the situation more manageable. You thought your neighborhood was pretty safe. Suddenly, your sense of security is shaken. Now, what this law does is help to establish that sense of comfort by providing information about who lives right next to you. Now, many have said that there is a risk of this law not allowing those individuals that have been convicted of sexual crimes against children to enjoy privacy. But don't we think that, in a way, that is something they have chosen to give up by committing said crimes? Yes, there is a possibility that if a child goes missing, they are looked upon first. But shouldn't it be that way? Isn't it our duty to protect our kids and search first in the obvious places? We all know that when a person commits a crime, they run the risk of losing certain liberties, and that is, in fact, the price they must pay. So does it provide justice? Absolutely. Does it contribute to equity? I say yes. Think about it. If a person has not committed a crime, then he or she has nothing to hide. This would actually force the person also to make sure they continue to search for help, as well as make sure they continue to walk on a straight path. For example, the current law mandates that all those categorized as level 1 offenders continue to register with their local police departments, no matter where they moved for 20 years. This is the price they pay for their actions, and if they can carry on with their lives and not violate the terms of their parole or agreement, then they can in fact return to their normal lives without having to register anymore. So it does provide equity as well.
Well, Ms. Braun, we really appreciate you being here tonight and providing us with some valuable insight on Megan's Law and from a social work perspective. Thank you so very much for joining us.
It was great to be here. Thank you for having me.
This evening, we've heard Lee Kanji interview Senator Oscar Salgado, social worker Skylar Braun, and economist Guillermo Sandoval. These interviews have helped us gain various perspectives about the events leading up to the implementation of Megan's Law. They have helped us to understand what this law entails, its effects on the victims, the perpetrators, and their communities. Hopefully, we were able to give our viewers a clear picture from all sides of the policy. This is Grace Johnson for News 24, and good night.